I guess the first thing people want to know is why I can't stand still when I'm singing. But I don't think I have to explain that to someone like you or anyone who feels like you got something out of your system.
The king of rock and roll wasn't supposed to die at 42. Elvis Presley, the boy from Tupelo who shook the world with his hips, voice, and charm, seemed larger than life. But on the morning of August 16, 1977, that illusion shattered forever. Found unconscious at his beloved Graceland estate, his sudden death stunned millions. Official statements spoke of a heart attack, but whispers began immediately, whispers of pills, of cover-ups, of a body pushed to the breaking point. For decades, the Presley family fought to keep the truth sealed away. But now, with the release of hidden autopsy files and testimonies, what really happened inside that Memphis morgue has finally come to light. And the truth isn't good. What doctors uncovered about Elvis's health, his lifestyle, and his final hours may forever change the way fans remember the man who defined an era. Elvis Presley's final day on Earth began like so many others in the last year of his life. Restless, weary, and cloaked in the haze of sleepless nights. At Graceland, the sprawling Memphis mansion that had become his fortress from the world, the king awoke in the late morning hours on August 16, 1977. He was only 42, yet years of relentless touring, failed relationships, and an ever-growing dependence on prescription drugs had aged him far beyond his years. Witnesses recalled that his skin had lost its glow, his weight fluctuated dramatically, and his once unshakable energy seemed to flicker in and out like a candle in the wind. He was due to fly to Portland, Maine later that night to kick off another tour, but the truth was, Elvis's body was already failing him. That day he spent time with his fiancée, Ginger Alden, a young actress and model who had been living with him at Graceland. To the outside world, Ginger represented stability, a new chapter, a new love, but behind closed doors, she was watching a man unravel before her eyes. Elvis, plagued by insomnia, had developed a ritual of staying awake deep into the night, popping pills prescribed by a team of doctors who were more enablers than healers. These sleep cocktails were meant to quiet his racing mind, but they often left him groggy and unpredictable. Still, he pushed through, insisting he had obligations to his fans and an image to maintain. On that final day, Elvis played racquetball on the Graceland court with friends, laughing, sweating, and, for a fleeting moment, appearing like the vibrant man the world had adored. He even sang a few lines at the piano afterward, his voice still carrying a trace of its old magic, though the strength behind it had waned. To those around him, the mood seemed almost hopeful. He had been talking about marriage, about the future, about getting healthy. But as the sun set, his demons returned. That evening, Elvis complained of not being able to sleep. He told Ginger he was going to read in the bathroom, a habit she had seen many times before. With book in hand, he retreated into the solitude of that small space, perhaps seeking comfort, perhaps running from thoughts he couldn't silence. He told Ginger not to fall asleep until he returned, words that now carry an eerie finality. As the hours ticked past midnight, Elvis remained in the bathroom. The mansion was quiet, the sound of cicadas buzzing outside the windows, while the king of rock and roll wrestled with the weight of exhaustion and the cocktail of substances in his system. Around him, bottles of prescription pills littered counters and drawers, amphetamines, barbiturates, painkillers, and sedatives. Elvis had become reliant on these to function, though few could have predicted just how destructive this dependence had become. In the early morning hours, silence filled Graceland once again. Ginger dozed lightly, waiting for him to return. She would later recall that she drifted in and out of sleep, unaware that just a few feet away, history was taking a tragic turn. When she finally rose hours later and went to check, she would find Elvis lying motionless, face down on the floor of the bathroom, book still in hand. His final day had ended not with fanfare, not with a farewell performance, but with a quiet collapse that marked the end of an era. The king was gone, and the world would never be the same. Yet, in that moment, as the household scrambled and panic set in, no one truly understood what had caused his death. Only the autopsy files, locked away and whispered about for years, would tell the full story. And what they revealed was far darker than the simple explanation of a heart attack. It was just after 9 in the morning when Ginger Alden realized something was wrong. She had drifted in and out of light sleep through the night, waiting for Elvis to return from the bathroom as he had promised. But the hours stretched on, and the silence became unbearable. She called out softly at first, expecting him to answer, but there was no reply. With a growing sense of unease, she walked down the hall and pushed open the bathroom door, only to be met with the sight that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Elvis lay sprawled on the floor, his face pressed into the carpet, a book still clutched loosely in his hand. His body was motionless, his skin pale. And it was immediately clear that something terrible had happened. Ginger screamed for help, her voice echoing through the halls of Graceland. Within moments, the mansion erupted in chaos. Staff members rushed to the scene, some in disbelief, others already fearing the worst. Joe Esposito, Elvis's road manager and one of his closest friends, was among the first to arrive. He later described the surreal moment of seeing his boss, the man who had conquered the world, lifeless on the bathroom floor. They tried desperately to revive him, calling emergency services and attempting CPR, but the king's body gave no response. Paramedics arrived quickly, sirens blaring through the Memphis morning, and Graceland became the site of a frantic rescue attempt. Elvis was rushed to Baptist Memorial Hospital, but even as doctors worked frantically, the truth was already evident. The monitors showed no heartbeat, no pulse. The king of rock and roll had slipped away before anyone could save him. At 3:30 that afternoon, after repeated efforts to resuscitate him failed, Elvis Presley was officially pronounced dead. He was only 42. News of his death spread like wildfire. Radio stations broke into programming with urgent bulletins, television anchors struggled to hold back tears, and fans across the globe were plunged into shock. Outside Graceland, crowds began to gather within minutes, weeping openly, clutching records, photographs, and flowers. For millions, it felt impossible to imagine a world without Elvis. He had been a constant presence, an immortal figure, and yet here was the brutal truth. He was gone. But inside Baptist Memorial Hospital, another drama was beginning to unfold. The cause of Elvis's death was not immediately clear. The official announcement cited a massive heart attack, but whispers began almost instantly among staff and insiders. Elvis's body, once the image of youthful rebellion, now bore the signs of years of abuse, both physical and chemical. His abdomen was distended, his skin discolored, and his eyes glazed. To those who saw him, the explanation of a simple heart attack felt incomplete. The truth would not come from the hospital ward or the press release. It would come from the cold, sterile room where doctors prepared to open the king's body and record in meticulous detail the secrets it had been hiding. And as the gurney was wheeled into the morgue, the stage was set for one of the most controversial autopsies in American history. The body of Elvis Presley was transported to the morgue at Baptist Memorial Hospital, and what followed was an event steeped in secrecy, controversy, and suspicion. The world demanded answers, yet the people closest to Elvis seemed determined to control the narrative. Leading the procedure was Dr. Jerry Francisco, the Shelby County coroner, joined by a team of pathologists and medical examiners. The weight of the moment was undeniable. This was not just any autopsy. This was the autopsy of the most famous entertainer on the planet. A man adored by millions. A man whose death would be dissected as relentlessly as his life had been. Almost immediately, red flags appeared. Within hours of Elvis being declared dead, Dr. Prater Francisco released a statement to the press claiming that Elvis Presley had died of cardiac arrhythmia, essentially a heart attack. The declaration came so quickly that many questioned how he could possibly know before toxicology results or microscopic tissue studies were complete. It was as though the story had been decided before the scalpel even touched the skin. Inside the morgue, however, the reality was more complex. As the doctors began their work, they quickly realized that Elvis's body bore signs of extensive deterioration from years of abuse. His heart was enlarged, nearly twice the size of a normal man's, a telltale sign of long-term strain. His arteries showed narrowing consistent with advanced cardiovascular disease. His liver was scarred and damaged, pointing toward fatty liver disease or possible cirrhosis. And perhaps most shocking of all was the condition of his colon, which was impacted and stretched to nearly twice its size. A sign of chronic constipation linked to his prescription drug use and poor diet. These findings painted a picture of a man whose body had been fighting a losing battle long before that fateful morning. Yet the official word remained simple. Elvis had died of a heart problem, nothing more. Behind closed doors, however, murmurs spread among hospital staff and medical insiders that drugs had played a far greater role than anyone was willing to admit. The autopsy team had collected blood, urine, and tissue samples for toxicology testing, but results would take weeks, and by then, the initial headlines would have cemented the heart attack narrative in the public's mind. Many would later argue that Dr. Francisco's premature statement was no accident. It was a deliberate attempt to shield Elvis's legacy, to protect the Presley family, and perhaps to preserve the profitability of an empire that depended on the king's image remaining untarnished. The autopsy itself became the subject of intense scrutiny. Reporters camped outside the hospital, desperate for leaks. Fans speculated endlessly, some convinced that Elvis had been poisoned, others insisting that his drug use had been covered up. And inside that room, the doctors found themselves caught between science and myth, truth and protection. The files they compiled over the following days would be locked away, sealed from public view for decades, sparking endless conspiracy theories and feeding a mystery that only grew with time. Officially, the king had died of natural causes. Unofficially, the evidence suggested a far darker reality, that Elvis Presley's lifestyle, his dependency on pills, and the enabling of those around him had set his body on a path toward destruction long before the morning he collapsed at Graceland. The autopsy had begun, but the battle over his legacy had only just started. When the pathologists looked deeper into Elvis Presley's body, they were confronted with a shocking truth. The king of rock and roll had been living in a body that was crumbling from the inside out. To fans, Elvis was still the man who had electrified the world with his hips, his voice, and his swagger. But under the surface, he was carrying the scars of years of excess, addiction, and relentless pressure. His heart was one of the most disturbing discoveries. Weighing nearly twice the size of a normal heart, it revealed the toll of years of high blood pressure, poor diet, and drug use. Doctors noted that it wasn't just enlarged, it was straining, desperately trying to keep blood pumping through arteries narrowed by plaque. Elvis's cardiovascular system looked more like that of an old man in his 70s than a performer barely in his 40s. His liver told an equally grim story. Scarred and damaged. It bore signs of fatty liver disease and early cirrhosis. Decades of poor eating habits, fried foods, sugar-laden snacks, and midnight feasts of Southern comfort food had combined with prescription pills to attack his liver relentlessly. By 1977, the organ that filters toxins from the blood was itself toxic, swollen, and overworked, a silent warning that went unheeded. Then came the discovery that left even hardened examiners stunned. Elvis's colon, stretched and impacted. It was nearly twice its normal size, a grotesque indicator of chronic constipation, a condition he had battled for years. Caused by his dependence on barbiturates and opioids, which slow down the digestive system, Elvis's colon was so compromised that doctors believed it would have eventually ruptured had he lived longer. The bloating of his abdomen, the discomfort he often complained of, and even his fluctuating weight all pointed back to this overlooked but devastating condition. Elvis was literally carrying the weight of his own poison system inside him. Other findings added to the grim portrait. His body showed signs of long-term prescription drug use, opiates, barbiturates, and sedatives, all leaving their fingerprints in weakened organs, sluggish metabolism, and chemical imbalance. His lungs bore damage, possibly from years of smoking cigars and being surrounded by secondhand smoke. Even his skin, once radiant, had lost elasticity. A visual sign of the storm raging within. Forensic experts later admitted that Elvis's body appeared far older than 42. He may have been young in years, but physically, he was a man decades beyond his age. One examiner reportedly remarked that Elvis's body looked more like that of an exhausted old man than a global superstar. And yet, to the outside world, this information was never fully revealed at the time. Dr. Francisco's official statement kept things simple. Elvis had died of a heart problem. End of story. The shocking details of the autopsy, the grotesque reality of a body in ruin, were kept sealed, locked away in files and archives, hidden from the fans who idolized him. It was easier, perhaps, to let the world remember the image of Elvis in a jumpsuit, commanding the stage under the lights of Las Vegas, than to let them picture what the doctors had seen on that table. But those files remained. And when parts of them finally surfaced years later, they painted a devastating picture of a man who had been slowly dying long before that August morning. The king had built a legacy of power and glory, but his body told a different story, a story of fragility, decay, and the crushing cost of being Elvis Presley. While the world mourned and fans clung to the official statement that Elvis Presley had died of a heart attack, behind the scenes, another storm was brewing, one that would unravel the tidy explanation given to the public. Toxicology testing, the process of analyzing blood, urine, and tissue for traces of drugs, would take weeks to complete. But when the results came back, they exposed a disturbing truth. Elvis's system contained an alarming cocktail of prescription medications, enough to raise serious questions about how much his drug dependency had contributed to his death. The report revealed high levels of codeine, significantly above therapeutic range, as well as large amounts of Demerol, Quaaludes, Placidil, and Valium. Together, these substances created a lethal mix that depressed his central nervous system, slowed his breathing, and placed unbearable strain on his already enlarged heart. The toxicology results showed that Elvis was not simply a man with heart disease. He was a man whose body had been overwhelmed by years of chemical abuse. Yet even as these findings came to light, the truth was softened, manipulated, and in some cases, buried. Dr. Jerry Francisco continued to insist that drugs played no role in Elvis's death, stating that the heart attack was the sole cause, a line repeated in news reports around the globe. But other doctors present at the autopsy strongly disagreed. They argued that the combination of barbiturates, opiates, and sedatives found in his system was more than enough to have caused respiratory failure, which in turn triggered cardiac arrest. The contradiction fueled a firestorm of speculation. Why would the official report dismiss the role of drugs when the toxicology evidence pointed directly to them? The answer, many believe, lay in the power of Elvis's image. In 1977, Presley wasn't just a man. He was a multi-million-dollar industry, with a catalog of records, movies, and merchandise that continued to generate enormous revenue even after his death. To admit that he had overdosed on prescription drugs would have stained his legacy, reduced his myth, and perhaps even damaged the financial empire that his estate depended upon. And so, the toxicology results were quietly downplayed, their damning details hidden in medical files and whispered about in hushed tones. Over time, insiders began to leak pieces of the truth. Former pathologists and medical examiners hinted in interviews that the drug levels were shocking. Some went as far as to say that Elvis's death was entirely preventable, and that it was only a matter of time before his body gave out under the strain of the chemicals he consumed daily. The controversy only deepened when portions of the toxicology files were sealed for decades, ordered closed to the public until the year 2027. This decision, reportedly at the request of the Presley family, added fuel to conspiracy theories. What were they hiding? Why did they not want the world to see the full truth? Some believed the family sought to protect Elvis's dignity, while others suspected darker motives, a cover-up of negligence by doctors, enablers, and those who profited from keeping Elvis on stage despite his deteriorating health. Whatever the reason, the toxicology controversy ensured that the story of Elvis Presley's death would never be simple. Officially, he died of a heart attack. Unofficially, the evidence showed that his heart stopped because his body was drowning in prescription drugs. The King's final performance wasn't on stage in Vegas or on television, it was in a morgue, where the clash between truth and myth played out in silence. The autopsy files didn't just reveal what killed Elvis. They revealed a system that allowed it to happen. A system built on money, fame, and denial. In the days after Elvis Presley's death, as grief-stricken fans flooded Memphis and the world reeled from the loss of its brightest star, another drama was quietly taking place behind the closed doors of Graceland and Shelby County. The Presley family, led by Elvis's father Vernon, faced a decision that would shape the legacy of the king for decades to come. What to do with the autopsy report, a document that laid bare the shocking details of his physical decline, his dependence on prescription drugs, and the grotesque state of his body? Vernon Presley, devastated by the loss of his only son, made a choice that raised eyebrows even then. He requested that large portions of the autopsy file be sealed, restricted from public view for 50 years until the year 2027. This unprecedented move immediately fueled suspicion. Families often protect the dignity of loved ones, but sealing a report for half a century sent a clear message. There were details inside that they did not want the world to know. Officially, the justification was to protect the family's privacy, to prevent sensational exploitation of Elvis's medical history. But many insiders and journalists saw it differently. They believed the Presley family, in collusion with local authorities, sought to bury the truth because it was too damaging to Elvis's myth, too humiliating for a man idolized as the embodiment of vitality, rebellion, and charm. The rumors grew louder when leaks from those close to the case suggested the files contained evidence of staggering drug levels, of organs ravaged by years of abuse, and of a colon so impacted it was nearly ready to rupture. These details, whispered in hushed conversations, painted a picture of a man whose death was not sudden or mysterious, but the inevitable outcome of years of neglect. The family's silence only made matters worse. As decades passed, fans clamored for answers. Books were written, documentaries filmed. Insiders came forward with fragments of the truth, but the sealed files remained the ultimate forbidden treasure. What was so damaging that it had to be hidden until most of his generation of fans would be gone? The Presley estate, meanwhile, transformed Elvis into a larger-than-life brand, turning Graceland into a shrine that drew millions of visitors. His image was carefully managed, young, vibrant, commanding the stage, while the darker truth of his final years was pushed aside. But those who had been close to Elvis knew the reality. They knew of the midnight trips to doctors, the suitcases full of pills on tour, the bloated figure struggling to make it through a performance, and the endless enabling by those who profited from keeping him working. For them, the autopsy files were not just medical records. They were proof of a life consumed by excess and exploitation. Even today, with much of the information leaked or revealed through secondary sources, the sealed files remain a symbol of the family's desperate attempt to protect not only Elvis's dignity, but also the empire built on his name. As 2027 approaches, fans and historians wait with bated breath, wondering what final revelations those hidden documents will bring. And yet, even without full disclosure, the pattern is clear. The Presley family chose silence over transparency, control over truth. By sealing the files, they didn't stop speculation. They ignited it. They ensured that Elvis's death would never be seen as a simple tragedy, but as a mystery, a puzzle with missing pieces, a story wrapped in secrecy that continues to haunt the world nearly half a century later. For years after Elvis Presley's death, the official narrative remained locked in place. He had died of a heart attack. End of story. But as time passed, medical experts who had studied the autopsy, reviewed the toxicology, or even been present in Memphis that week, began to contradict the official line. Some were blunt, others careful, but the message was the same. Elvis did not simply die of a bad heart. He died because his body was overwhelmed by prescription drugs and neglect. One of the first to break ranks was Dr. Cyril Wecht, a prominent forensic pathologist who reviewed the files. He pointed out that the levels of codeine in Elvis's system were toxic, and that multiple other sedatives were present at dangerous concentrations. To Wecht, it was obvious. Elvis had died of a drug-induced respiratory failure that caused his heart to stop. He accused local officials of protecting Elvis's reputation rather than telling the truth. Others echoed his concerns. Dr. Nikopoulos, Elvis's longtime physician, nicknamed Dr. Nick, came under scrutiny for prescribing thousands of pills to Elvis in the months leading up to his death. In one 9-month span alone, Elvis received more than 10,000 doses of amphetamines, barbiturates, and narcotics. While Dr. Nick insisted he was trying to manage Elvis's many ailments, Critics argued he had enabled a deadly addiction. Medical insiders later admitted that Elvis's lifestyle and pill consumption had been an open secret in Memphis. Everyone around him knew, but no one stopped it. As these voices grew louder, the heart attack narrative crumbled. The autopsy files, when partially revealed, supported the experts' claims. Elvis's organs showed damage consistent with long-term drug abuse, and his colon and liver pointed to chronic conditions that his prescriptions only worsened. By the 1990s, it was no longer controversial among medical professionals to say that Elvis's death had been drug-related, yet the official record remained unchanged, a testament to the power of myth over fact. For fans, this was painful to hear. To think that the king's death was preventable, that doctors and enablers stood by while he destroyed himself, was a tragedy greater than any ballad he ever sang. Medical experts had spoken, and their verdict was clear. Elvis didn't just die, he was failed. By medicine, by those around him, and by the fame that demanded he keep performing until his body could take no more. The autopsy files of Elvis Presley reveal more than just the condition of a body. They tell the story of a man consumed by his own legend. On the surface, he was the king of rock and roll, adored by millions, his voice immortal, his image stamped on every corner of American culture. But beneath the sequined jumpsuits and bright lights, he was a man trapped by the pressures of fame, a man who leaned on prescription drugs to keep going, and a man whose own body became the battlefield where excess and neglect waged war. His death at 42 was not simply a tragedy of timing, it was a warning about what happens when humanity is sacrificed for stardom. The files, sealed for decades, show the cost of a life lived at full throttle without pause. An enlarged heart, scarred liver, and impacted colon were not just medical notes. They were evidence of years of abuse hidden behind the curtain of Graceland. For fans, the release of these details was devastating, yet also clarifying. It stripped away the myth of invincibility. They thought they had seen everything inside Graceland. The jumpsuits, the gold records, the Cadillac collection gleaming under museum lights. But beneath the polished floors and velvet ropes was a place no tour guide ever mentioned. Locked, hidden, and untouched for decades, it was Elvis Presley's basement. What was inside would leave even the most loyal fans speechless. Dusty boxes stacked against crumbling brick walls, a safe sealed tight since the king's final days. Handwritten notes that revealed the kind of man Elvis never wanted the public to see. For years, the Presley family kept it closed, protecting his image and guarding his secrets. But once the door was finally opened, what they found shook even them to the core. Because what lived in that basement wasn't just memorabilia. It was Elvis's shadow, the truth of a life spent in the spotlight, but haunted by demons in the dark. And once the contents came out, there was no going back. Graceland has always been more than a mansion. To Elvis's fans, it became a holy site, a place where millions walked through the gates each year to catch a glimpse of the life their idol once lived. They saw the jungle room, the music room, the mirrored staircases, the velvet walls, the trophies, and the glory. But what most never realized was that the heart of Graceland wasn't in the rooms bathed in light. It was hidden beneath, down a narrow staircase few dared to enter. The basement was never part of the official tour. Guides would mention it in passing but carefully change the subject, insisting that part of the home was closed off for family reasons. Even longtime staff whispered about what might be down there, though most admitted they had never been allowed inside. For decades, rumors swirled. Some claimed Elvis had used it as a private recording den, cutting rough takes of songs he didn't want anyone to hear. Others swore it was his hiding place when the pressures of fame grew too great, a space where he could be alone with his thoughts, away from cameras and obligations. Collectors and insiders speculated endlessly. If Elvis kept anything deeply personal, it wouldn't be in the trophy cases upstairs. It would be in that basement. And yet the truth was stranger and far more haunting than anyone imagined. Because when the doors were finally opened, what lay inside wasn't just a collection of mementos, it was evidence of a man struggling to hold his world together. The king of rock and roll, who seemed untouchable to the outside world, had left behind a time capsule of vulnerability, fear, and longing. The basement wasn't a place of glamour, it was a vault of shadows. And once those shadows were brought into the light, they revealed a story Elvis never wanted told. The first boxes they pulled from Elvis's basement were not filled with glittering stage costumes or priceless gold records. They were ordinary cardboard, taped shut, their labels faded by time. But when opened, they revealed fragments of a hidden life. Inside were reels of old tape, their labels scrawled in Elvis's unmistakable handwriting. Midnight thoughts. For me only. Never play. They weren't polished studio takes or rehearsal tracks. They were recordings of Elvis alone with his guitar, his voice stripped bare, trembling with emotion. On some tapes, he sang songs the world never heard, raw ballads about loss, regret, and weariness. On others, he spoke more than he sang, using the microphone like a confessional, as though he knew no one else could understand the weight of carrying the crown of rock and roll. Alongside the tapes were notebooks filled with scribbled lyrics, half-finished lines that bled with pain. One page read, "Fame is the loneliest prison, and I am its warden and prisoner all the same." Another contained only 3 words written over and over. "I want peace." Then came the photographs, personal snapshots never meant for public eyes. Elvis sitting alone at the piano, head bowed, cigarette burning down in his hand. Elvis walking through Graceland's halls at night, his face gaunt, his eyes heavy with sadness. These weren't the images of the king larger than life, but of a man shrinking beneath the crown. For years, fans saw him as invincible, a legend who could command any stage. But in these dusty boxes, he revealed himself as fragile, aching, desperate for someone to see the real person behind the legend. The basement, in those first discoveries, wasn't just a storage room. It was a mirror reflecting the cracks in Elvis's soul. And the deeper they dug, the more it became clear. He hadn't just left behind treasures, he had left behind the truth he never dared to share with the world. As more crates and trunks were carried up from the basement, the picture of Elvis's hidden world grew stranger. At first, there were items you might expect: stage outfits that never made it to the spotlight, custom-made jumpsuits with rhinestones missing, sketches of designs he seemed to have abandoned. But then came objects that left even seasoned collectors unsettled. One trunk contained dozens of prescription bottles, some still half-filled, each with Elvis's name carefully typed across the labels. Many were familiar, the same kinds of medications that fueled rumors about his final days. But some were unmarked, with only handwritten notes on masking tape, cryptic words like, "For the nights I can't sleep," or "Take when the walls close in." Alongside them were stacks of spiritual books, worn from use, from nearly every faith imaginable. The Bible sat next to texts on Buddhism, mysticism, astrology, even obscure works about life after death. It was as though Elvis had been searching for answers everywhere, desperate to find some kind of truth to quiet the storms inside him. In another box, old firearms rested beside strange personal trinkets, knives, badges, and police memorabilia he had quietly collected. There were reports that Elvis had been obsessed with law enforcement, handing out honorary badges, surrounding himself with symbols of authority, as if they gave him strength. But seeing them together, hidden away underground, felt different. It looked less like a hobby and more like an obsession. And then there were the costumes, not the glittering capes of his Las Vegas years, but bizarre outfits, robes, masks, uniforms he never wore in public. Why he kept them remained a mystery, but in the dim light of the basement, they seemed unsettling, almost theatrical, like disguises for a man trying to escape himself. Every artifact added another layer to the portrait. Elvis Presley wasn't just the king, he was a man grasping for control, for identity, for meaning, even as the world saw him as untouchable. And as strange as these objects were, they were nothing compared to what was found next. Among the most unsettling discoveries in the basement were a collection of reel-to-reel tapes tucked away in an old chest marked simply "Private." Unlike the musical recordings, these were not songs or rehearsals. They were spoken words, midnight confessions whispered into the void. The first tape began with silence, then the faint sound of Elvis shifting in his chair, clearing his throat, and finally speaking in a low, weary voice. "I don't know who I am anymore," he muttered, followed by a long pause. For the next hour, he poured out thoughts he never shared with his closest friends, let alone the millions who adored him. He talked about betrayal, about people he once trusted who turned on him, about the crushing weight of being Elvis Presley, when all he wanted was to be a man named Elvis Aaron. On one tape, his voice cracked as he spoke of Priscilla, of the love he lost and the regret he carried. On another, he spoke of Lisa Marie, his daughter, calling her his only true light, his only reason for fighting to keep going. But the most chilling recordings were the ones where he spoke of fame itself. He described it not as a blessing, but as a curse, a gilded cage that trapped him inside a role he could never escape. "They cheer for the king," he said bitterly, "but nobody sees the man who has to go home alone." At times, he drifted into paranoia, convinced that people were watching him, using him, waiting for him to fall. At other times, his words were drenched in sorrow, a man pleading with the darkness for peace he could never find in life. The confession tapes weren't meant for release. They weren't meant for anyone. They were Elvis's most private thoughts, sealed away in the one place he thought the world would never look, his basement. And hearing them now, decades later, was like stepping into his mind in his final years, a haunting reminder that even kings can crumble when the crown grows too heavy. As the basement was slowly emptied, there remained one object that overshadowed all the boxes, trunks, and dusty shelves: a large steel safe wedged against the far wall. Rust streaked its edges, its lock sealed shut, untouched for decades. For years, rumors swirled about Elvis owning safes filled with cash, jewels, or even government documents he had been gifted by powerful friends, but no one expected what was truly inside. After careful work, the lock was forced open, and the heavy door creaked forward, releasing a stale gust of air that seemed frozen in time. Inside were neatly stacked envelopes, each labeled in Elvis's unmistakable hand. They weren't contracts or financial ledgers. They were letters, dozens of them. Some written to friends and colleagues, others to names only a handful of people recognized, but most were to two women, Priscilla and Lisa Marie. The letters to Priscilla revealed a man who still carried immense love and sorrow for his lost marriage. In one, he wrote, "I wish I could have been stronger for you. I wore the crown, but I couldn't wear the man you needed. Another letter, never sent. Pleaded for forgiveness, confessing that the life of Elvis Presley consumed him so fully that it left little room for the man she had fallen in love with. These weren't the words of a superstar. They were the words of a broken husband. Then there were the letters to Lisa Marie. Heartfelt, emotional, sometimes rambling, they painted a portrait of a father desperate to protect his little girl from the weight of his fame. In one letter, written only months before his death, he confessed, "I don't want you to grow up in my shadow. I want you to be free. I want you to live without chains, the ones I put on myself." Reading them now, it is impossible not to hear the pain of a father who knew he might not be there to watch his daughter grow up. But perhaps the most shocking discovery inside the safe was not a letter, but a single, worn journal. Inside, Elvis had scribbled down thoughts about his career, his health, and his deep distrust of those around him. He wrote of feeling controlled, manipulated by handlers and business partners who cared more about money than the man himself. He wrote of dreams of escaping, of leaving it all behind, of disappearing from the public eye entirely. One chilling line stood out. "If I vanish, they'll never let me rest. If I stay, they'll work me to death. Either way, I lose." The safe didn't hold treasures of wealth. It held treasures of truth. And in those pages and letters, Elvis revealed more of himself than any performance ever could. The king of rock and roll had been trapped between his legend and his humanity, and in his basement safe, he left behind the evidence of just how heavy that burden had become. The deeper they searched the basement, the more the discoveries shifted from tragic to disturbing, painting a picture of Elvis Presley that few could have ever imagined. Among the artifacts were stacks of newspaper clippings. But these weren't about his own triumphs or concerts. They were about death. Elvis had kept detailed archives of obituaries and reports about other musicians who had died young, from Buddy Holly to Janis Joplin, as if he was cataloging the fates of his peers, warning himself of the road he too was traveling. Some pages were underlined, with chilling notes scribbled in the margins, "Too soon," "Why not me?" and "This is how legends end." Alongside these clippings were manila folders stuffed with police reports and case files, many of them unrelated to him entirely. How Elvis had acquired them was unclear, but they showed a fixation with crime, betrayal, and sudden loss, almost as though he was trying to piece together the patterns of human downfall. Even stranger were the notebooks filled with his own writings. They were not lyrics or song ideas, but rambling, paranoid reflections. He wrote about being watched, about phones tapped, about not trusting even the closest people in his circle. On one page, scrawled in frantic handwriting, he wrote, "They want the king, but they don't care if the man dies." It wasn't just paranoia. These words carried the raw pain of someone who believed his fame had turned into a prison he could never escape. Then came another unsettling collection: masks, costumes, and elaborate disguises. Hidden in a corner trunk were wigs, fake mustaches, police uniforms, even elaborate robes. Some were pristine, others worn and frayed, as if used more than once. Had Elvis been preparing to walk outside unnoticed? Or were these disguises part of a private obsession, a fantasy of slipping away from being Elvis Presley, if only for a night? Tucked in with them were maps with routes highlighted, hotels circled, and handwritten notes suggesting plans to leave Graceland without anyone knowing. It raised the question, was Elvis preparing to vanish? To leave behind the fame and the chaos that consumed him? Or was it only wishful thinking from a man who no longer knew how to be himself? The basement revealed a man obsessed with endings, with death, with escape. It revealed a king not basking in glory, but drowning in fear. These weren't the treasures of a superstar. They were the artifacts of a man trying desperately to hold on to control, even as he felt it slipping through his fingers. When whispers of the basement's contents reached the Presley family, reactions were mixed, and the secrets it revealed cut deeper than anyone outside Graceland could have imagined. For decades, the Presley legacy had been carefully curated, a balance of myth and memory that protected Elvis as both a cultural icon and a beloved father. But the letters, tapes, and artifacts dragged private wounds into the light, exposing family struggles that had long been buried beneath the legend. Some of the unsent letters Elvis had written to Priscilla revealed not just love and regret, but also bitterness over their divorce, over the pressures of fame that tore their marriage apart, and over the people he believed had come between them. In one letter, he accused unnamed advisors of manipulating him, of turning him against the woman he once trusted most. Though the letter was never sent, its words hung heavy with unresolved pain, suggesting Elvis felt betrayed not only by his handlers, but by the very institution of his marriage. For Priscilla, seeing those words must have been devastating, reopening old wounds that time had only partly healed. Even more haunting were Elvis's letters and notes to Lisa Marie. They were not written to a child, but to the woman he imagined she would one day become. He wrote about the dangers of fame, about the emptiness behind the curtain, and about the vultures who circled stars until they had nothing left to give. "Don't let them use you like they used me," he warned in one note, a chilling prediction considering Lisa Marie's own struggles with the spotlight years later. He wrote of his fears for her future, of his desire to see her live a life free from the chains of celebrity, even as he admitted he had no idea how to escape those chains himself. The basement also contained financial documents that hinted at growing problems behind the scenes, records of debts, contracts, and disputes that suggested the Presley empire was not as stable as fans believed. Hidden among the memorabilia were notes expressing Elvis's anger at how money was being handled, his frustration at being treated as an endless resource rather than a human being. These revelations struck a painful chord for the family, who had worked tirelessly to protect his image and preserve his legacy. But perhaps the hardest truth the basement revealed was that Elvis had contemplated walking away from it all. The maps, disguises, and rambling notes weren't the fantasies of a man playing dress-up. They were the desperate plans of someone who saw no other escape. For his family, this knowledge must have been unbearable, forcing them to confront the possibility that Elvis had not died simply of poor health or exhaustion, but of a slow, crushing despair that consumed him long before his final night. The secrets found in the basement didn't just change how the world saw Elvis, they changed how his family understood the man they had lost, forcing them to face the shadows of a king who had lived two lives, one for the public and one hidden underground, waiting to be uncovered. The revelations from Elvis Presley's basement did more than shock fans or intrigue historians. They forced the world to confront the fragile, hidden humanity of a man who had been mythologized as larger than life. For decades, the king of rock and roll had been remembered through a carefully polished lens. The swiveling hips, the screaming crowds, the rhinestone jumpsuits, the triumphant returns to the stage. But beneath Graceland, in a space untouched by the museum lights, was a different Elvis, a man who carried fears, regrets, and obsessions that the public never saw. The tapes where he spoke into the darkness weren't just confessions, they were cries for help from a soul trapped between two identities. Elvis Aaron, the boy from Tupelo who longed for peace, and Elvis Presley, the global icon who could never be left alone. The letters to Priscilla and Lisa Marie weren't just private messages. They were raw evidence of a man who loved deeply, but struggled to keep love alive under the crushing weight of fame. The strange disguises and highlighted maps weren't just odd relics. They suggested a king who dreamed of escape, who wanted to disappear and shed the crown that had become too heavy to carry. Even the clippings, the crime reports, the endless notes about death and endings painted a picture of someone who saw his own fate coming long before it arrived. The world had been told that Elvis died of a heart attack, of exhaustion, of poor health worsened by addiction. But the basement suggested another truth, that Elvis was already dying long before his final day, a slow spiritual unraveling that no doctor could have cured. For his fans, these discoveries were devastating yet strangely comforting. Devastating because the king they worshipped was shown to be so vulnerable, so broken, so painfully human. Comforting because they revealed that beneath the glitter and the legend was a man who felt the same fears, heartbreaks, and longings as everyone else. He was not a god, not untouchable, but a man who carried burdens too heavy for one person to bear. The Presley family, for their part, faced an impossible task. How do you preserve a legacy when the truth threatens to fracture it? Do you hide the evidence, locking it away again to protect the myth? Or do you share it, letting the world finally see Elvis not as an untouchable king, but as a man consumed by his crown? Their silence in the years since the discoveries only deepened the mystery, leaving fans to speculate, argue, and imagine what Elvis's final years were truly like. But in the end, perhaps the greatest gift of the basement isn't the shock or the scandal. It's the reminder that legends are human. Elvis Presley gave the world music that still shakes the soul, performances that still electrify. Priscilla Presley, the name that forever echoes beside Elvis, is remembered as the girl who became the queen of Graceland. To the public, she was the teenage beauty swept into a fairy tale romance, the bride in the glamorous Las Vegas wedding, the mother of his only child, and the woman who stood by the king of rock and roll until his world crumbled. But what if that fairy tale was only a carefully staged illusion? What if behind the glossy magazine covers, the romantic photos, and the legend of Elvis and Priscilla lay a secret past so dark, so carefully hidden, that it could shatter everything we thought we knew? For decades, Priscilla kept her silence, preserving the myth of their love and protecting the Presley legacy. But now the cracks have widened, and long-buried truths are finally surfacing. This is not the story the world was told. This is not the image fans held on to for half a century. This is Priscilla Presley's secret past, revealed at last, and it will change the way history remembers her forever. Before she was Priscilla Presley, she was Priscilla Ann Wagner, born on May 24, 1945, in Brooklyn, New York, a child whose life was marked by tragedy before it had even begun. Her biological father, U.S. Navy pilot James Wagner, was killed in a plane crash when she was just a baby, leaving her with a void she could never fill. Her mother, Anne, was suddenly a young widow with an infant, to raise alone in a world still recovering from war. She remarried to a U.S. Air Force officer named Paul Beaulieu, and with that decision, Priscilla's life was set on a path of constant upheaval. Her stepfather's military career meant endless relocations, from Connecticut to Texas, Maine to Germany. For outsiders, it looked adventurous, but for a young girl, it meant never having roots, never building lasting friendships, always being the new face in an unfamiliar place. Priscilla carried a loneliness that was never spoken of, a need for stability that gnawed at her. Behind her bright smile was a young girl who longed to belong to someone, somewhere, forever. This instability, this sense of never being fully grounded, would later make her vulnerable to the charms of someone far older, far more powerful, and far more dangerous than any teenage girl should ever have encountered. What most people don't know is that even before Elvis entered her life, Priscilla had already learned how to wear masks, how to adjust to expectations, how to be who others wanted her to be rather than who she truly was. Her mother and stepfather, strict and disciplined, raised her in a world of military order, but inside she carried a secret longing to escape into fantasy, into music, into dreams bigger than the bases and barracks she was trapped in. So when fate carried her family to Wiesbaden, West Germany, she had no idea that the move would place her in the direct path of a man who would rewrite her destiny. She was just 14 years old when she first heard whispers that Elvis Presley was stationed nearby. She was only a child when her friends teased her about the possibility of meeting him. Yet beneath that innocent excitement was something deeper, a desperation for connection, a hunger to be seen, that would set her on a course into history's most controversial love story. Priscilla Presley's childhood wasn't the fairy tale people imagined. It was a crucible of loss, instability, and yearning that forged her into someone ready to step into the spotlight, even if it meant surrendering her freedom. It was 1959, in Wiesbaden, West Germany, where the U.S. military stationed families after the war, and where a young teenage girl named Priscilla Beaulieu would stumble into the moment that would change her life forever. She was just 14, still in school, still under the strict roof of her military stepfather, when she was invited to a party unlike anything she could have imagined. Elvis Presley, already the biggest star on earth, was serving his military duty nearby, and though the world only saw the glamorous headlines of a superstar abroad, the truth was that Elvis was lonely, restless, and searching for someone to fill the void left by fame and isolation. That night, when Priscilla walked into the room, shy, quiet, and barely old enough to be noticed, Elvis saw something in her that others overlooked. To him, she was young, innocent, untouched by the harshness of celebrity, a canvas he could shape. For Priscilla, the moment was overwhelming. This wasn't just a pop singer. This was Elvis Presley, the man every girl in the world dreamed about, and somehow he was looking at her, speaking to her, choosing her. The world has often romanticized this encounter, painting it as destiny, but the truth was far more complicated. Elvis was 24, already a man, already carrying the weight of fame and desire, while Priscilla was barely in her teens, still a child in every sense of the word. Her parents were suspicious at first, alarmed by the age gap, but Elvis charmed them, convincing them that his intentions were pure, that their daughter was safe in his company. But safe was not the word history would later use. Their relationship began in secrecy, with late-night meetings, music sessions, and whispered promises that blurred the line between fairy tale and exploitation. For Priscilla, it was intoxicating. Here was the most famous man alive, treating her like she was the only girl in the world. For Elvis, it was something else entirely: control, companionship, and the power to mold her into the image he wanted. Many years later, whispers would surface, critics would question, and biographers would expose what was hidden in plain sight. This was not a love story of equals. It was the beginning of a dynamic that placed a child under the spell of a superstar. At the time, Priscilla's friends envied her, her schoolmates gossiped about her, and the world, had it known, might have been outraged. But her reality was different. Each secret meeting, each promise Elvis made, pulled her deeper into his orbit, until the thought of life without him seemed impossible. Priscilla's childhood ended the moment she walked into that room in Germany. From that point on, her life would no longer be her own. It would belong to Elvis Presley, for better or for worse. When Priscilla finally moved into Graceland in 1963, the world thought she had entered a dream. A teenage girl plucked from obscurity and placed inside the palace of the king. To outsiders, it was the fantasy of every young woman alive. The sprawling mansion, the fancy cars, the glittering lights of fame, and Elvis Presley as her constant companion. But behind the iron gates, the truth was far different, and the hidden struggles she faced there revealed just how much of her life was not her own. Elvis controlled every detail of her existence. He dictated what she wore, from the color of her clothes to the length of her skirts. He insisted on certain hairstyles, choosing her makeup so that she looked like the woman he imagined rather than the girl she was. To the public, she was living a fairy tale. To Priscilla, she was living under a strict set of rules that suffocated her individuality. Friends who visited Graceland later said Priscilla seemed like a beautiful doll, carefully polished, placed on display, but never free to truly be herself. Elvis's entourage, known as the Memphis Mafia, watched her every move, reporting back to him if she stepped out of line. She was told who she could and couldn't talk to, where she could go, when she could leave. She was still in her teens, living under the roof of a man who was idolized by millions, but behind closed doors, she was learning what it meant to surrender her freedom. Elvis often left her alone for weeks at a time, disappearing on tours, films, and affairs that she was forced to ignore. While the tabloids sold an image of eternal romance, the truth was that Priscilla was often lonely, isolated in a mansion that felt more like a prison than a home. She had left behind her family, her friends, her school, her entire world in Germany, and now her identity existed solely in the reflection of Elvis Presley. Every smile she gave the cameras hid the growing cracks inside. Every glamorous photo concealed the reality of a young woman struggling with the weight of expectations she had never chosen. Even her education was disrupted, as Elvis wanted her focused on him, not her own ambitions. She began to learn the painful art of silence, of pretending everything was perfect when in reality she was suffocating. The world believed Priscilla Presley was living a dream, but in truth, she was trapped in Graceland, bound by loyalty, fear, and love for a man who demanded everything but gave little in return. These hidden struggles, buried for years, were the first signs that her story was not the fairy tale the world had been told. It was the quiet unraveling of a young woman behind gilded gates. When Elvis and Priscilla married in Las Vegas in 1967, the world rejoiced as if a fairy tale had come true. The headlines declared it the wedding of the century. Fans celebrated, and photographs of the bride and groom standing hand in hand spread across newspapers like proof that dreams could become reality. But beneath the surface of that carefully orchestrated event were cracks that had already begun to split the foundation of their marriage. For while the public saw romance, loyalty, and devotion, the truth was far more complicated and far darker. Elvis had never been faithful, not even in the early days of their relationship. His affairs with Hollywood starlets, co-stars, and beauty queens were legendary, whispered about in private, but never spoken of publicly. He would disappear for film shoots and tours, surrounded by women who adored him, and while the cameras captured his charm, Priscilla was left to swallow her pain and remain silent. Behind the glamour of Graceland, she endured nights of loneliness and betrayal, trapped in the role of the loyal wife while her husband's desires were pursued elsewhere. But Priscilla, too, had secrets she held close for decades. The young girl who once surrendered her freedom to Elvis began to crave independence, and in that craving came choices that shocked even those closest to her. She began an affair of her own, a relationship with her karate instructor, Mike Stone, a man who offered her the attention, intimacy, and respect that Elvis had denied her for years. Their connection was not just physical, it was emotional, a rebellion against the cage she had lived in for so long. When Elvis discovered the affair, his reaction was explosive. He reportedly spoke of wanting to have Mike Stone killed, his rage boiling over at the thought that the woman he had shaped, molded, and controlled could dare to defy him. Though the order was never carried out, it revealed just how volatile their world had become, how much darkness lingered beneath the golden facade. And while Elvis continued his affairs, his addictions, and his erratic behavior, Priscilla held her silence in public, smiling for photographs, keeping up the illusion, protecting not only his image, but also her own. Yet the truth was that their marriage was never the perfect romance fans believed it to be. It was a battlefield of secrets, lies, and betrayals on both sides. Their union, celebrated by millions, was held together not by love, but by illusion. And by the time the cameras captured their happiness, the reality behind the scenes was already falling apart. These untold affairs and secrets, buried for years, reveal that Elvis and Priscilla's marriage was not a fairy tale, but a tragic drama playing out in slow motion, with both participants trapped in roles they could no longer sustain. By 1972, the marriage of Elvis and Priscilla Presley was no longer a fairy tale. It was a hollow performance, held together for appearances, for the fans, and for the Presley legacy. Behind the gates of Graceland, their relationship had become a tangle of distance, resentment, and unspoken pain. Elvis, consumed by fame, by touring, by prescription drugs and reckless habits, had drifted further away from the woman who had once been his greatest companion. Priscilla, now in her late 20s, no longer the teenage girl he had met in Germany, had begun to discover her own identity, her own strength, and her own desires beyond being Elvis's creation. She had given him everything, her youth, her obedience, her silence, but now she wanted something back, her freedom. Their divorce, finalized in 1973, shocked fans worldwide. Newspapers printed it as though it was an inexplicable tragedy, a perfect marriage unraveling without warning. But the truth was much deeper. Elvis's infidelities were not just casual flings. They were wounds that cut deep, leaving Priscilla alone in a gilded cage, raising their daughter Lisa Marie, while her husband's attention strayed everywhere but home. The affair with Mike Stone had been the turning point, not just for Elvis's rage, but for Priscilla's realization that she could no longer live in his shadow. She wanted to be more than the woman waiting at home, more than the pretty face in the photographs. Yet, when the divorce papers were signed, the story the world was told was one of mutual love and respect. Elvis and Priscilla even walked out of the courthouse hand in hand, smiling, presenting an image of unity that belied the bitterness underneath. To the cameras, it looked like two people gracefully parting ways. Behind closed doors, however, the pain was raw, the betrayal was fresh, and the fractures were beyond repair. Elvis begged her to stay, pleading that he couldn't live without her, even as his actions proved otherwise. Priscilla, torn between loyalty to the man who had defined her life and the desperate need to reclaim her independence, chose the latter. The divorce settlement granted her financial security and joint custody of Lisa Marie, but what it truly gave her was the first taste of autonomy she had ever known. Still, she remained bound to him in ways the public never saw. She continued to visit Graceland, to support him, to protect his image, even as his life spiraled deeper into chaos. What wasn't said in the courtroom, what wasn't revealed to the fans, was that their love story had long since collapsed, and what remained was an arrangement built on appearances. Elvis and Priscilla's divorce was not simply the end of a marriage. It was the final breaking point of a carefully crafted illusion, a truth they both carried in silence, a truth that the world is only now beginning to understand. After the divorce, many expected Priscilla Presley to fade quietly into the background, forever remembered only as the teenage bride of the king. But what happened instead shocked even those closest to her. Rather than crumble under the weight of heartbreak and public scrutiny, Priscilla began to reinvent herself, piece by piece, transforming from a shadow in Elvis's world into a powerful figure in her own right. At first, the transition wasn't easy. She had spent her entire adult life being told what to wear, how to look, how to act, and suddenly the decisions were hers alone. But beneath the surface was a resilience that had been building for years, and now it surged forward. She stepped into the business world with a determination no one saw coming. When Elvis died in 1977, Graceland was nearly bankrupt. Decades of reckless spending and mismanagement had left the Presley estate in shambles, and many believed it was only a matter of time before the legendary home would be sold. But Priscilla, now the sole guardian of Lisa Marie's inheritance, refused to let Elvis's legacy collapse. She took charge of Elvis Presley Enterprises, surrounded herself with sharp advisors, and made the bold decision to open Graceland to the public in 1982. Critics scoffed at the idea, believing no one would pay to tour a dead star's home. But when the gates opened, fans flooded in by the thousands, and within just a few years, Priscilla had turned a near-bankrupt estate into one of the most profitable tourist attractions in the United States. She had succeeded where countless others had failed, proving she was more than just Elvis's former wife. She was a savvy businesswoman, a protector of the Presley name, and a strategist who understood the power of myth and memory. But Priscilla's reinvention didn't stop there. She stepped into Hollywood, landing roles in television and film, most famously the Naked Gun series, where she showed a charm and comedic timing no one expected. She built a career in her own right, becoming a celebrity independent of Elvis's shadow, and in doing so, reshaped her identity before the eyes of the world. Yet beneath her success was another layer of complexity. Some accused her of capitalizing on Elvis's legacy, of controlling his image for profit. Others argued she had finally claimed the independence he had denied her, building something lasting not for herself alone, but for their daughter, Lisa Marie. What is certain is that Priscilla's rise and reinvention were born out of survival. She had been molded, silenced, and overshadowed for so long, and now, at last, she was writing her own story. The woman once seen as only the wife of a legend had become a legend of reinvention herself, proving that the girl who entered Graceland a prisoner could leave it as a queen in her own right. For all of Priscilla Presley's success in reshaping her life and preserving Elvis's legacy, there were still shadows she worked tirelessly to keep hidden, secrets she tried to bury beneath the polished image of the devoted ex-wife and savvy businesswoman. Over the years, whispers and rumors followed her, some about her personal choices, others about her role in rewriting the Presley story. One of the most talked-about secrets revolved around her appearance. In the 1980s and 1990s, as she became a fixture in Hollywood and business circles, speculation grew about the lengths she went to preserve her beauty. Priscilla, once the fresh-faced girl who captivated Elvis, faced criticism for cosmetic procedures that changed her appearance dramatically. In 2008, a scandal erupted when it was revealed she had been the victim of an unlicensed doctor who injected her with industrial-grade silicone under the guise of cosmetic treatment. The story shocked fans and painted her not as a flawless icon, but as a woman vulnerable to the pressures of fame and aging, a woman who had quietly suffered humiliation in private while maintaining a glamorous facade in public. But the secrets went deeper than surgery. Insiders have long suggested that Priscilla controlled more of Elvis's legacy than most people realize. She influenced how his story was told, how his image was protected, and how his myth was preserved. Some former members of Elvis's inner circle accused her of reshaping history to her advantage, ensuring that her role in his life appeared larger and more noble than it may have been. Was she truly the devoted wife who endured in silence? Or was she a strategist who understood how to curate her image through the lens of tragedy? Then there were the hidden romances, the relationships she kept private long after Elvis's death. While the world still viewed her as Elvis's eternal bride, Priscilla sought companionship in men far outside the Presley myth, yet she rarely spoke publicly about them. Some whispered about her connection with Robert Kardashian, others about quiet romances with actors and businessmen, but she never allowed these details to overshadow the image of her as the grieving widow guarding Graceland. And perhaps the most painful secrets were those tied to her regrets. In candid moments, Priscilla admitted that she often wondered what her life might have been if she had never met Elvis in Germany. If she had lived an ordinary life instead of being swept into the orbit of a superstar. These confessions revealed a woman haunted by the choices of her youth, choices made when she was far too young to understand their consequences. For decades, she carried the burden of being both revered and judged. Adored by fans for her connection to Elvis, yet criticized by those who questioned her decisions. The secrets she tried to bury remind us that behind the carefully managed image was a human being, flawed, wounded, and searching for meaning long after the king had left the stage. Now, as Priscilla Presley enters the twilight of her life, the carefully constructed illusions of the past can no longer hold. The girl who was once a shy 14-year-old living on a military base in Germany has lived through a story that blurred the line between love and control, devotion and sacrifice, myth and truth. For decades, the world celebrated the fairy tale version, the king and his queen, the glamorous wife who stood by his side, the grieving woman who carried his memory after his death. But the final truth is far more complex, and finally, it is beginning to emerge. Priscilla's legacy is one of contradictions. She was both victim and architect, both shaped by Elvis, and a shaper of his legend. She surrendered her youth to him, lived under his rules, endured his betrayals, yet in the aftermath of their divorce and his tragic death, she rose with a resilience few expected. She transformed Graceland into a global shrine, preserved his music for generations, and became a guardian of his myth even as she struggled with her own identity. For some, this makes her heroic. For others, it raises uncomfortable questions. Did she protect his memory out of love? Or did she rewrite the story to preserve her own place in history? Did she endure for the sake of their daughter? Or was she too entangled in the fame and power to walk away sooner? These are the questions that hang over her legacy, questions that history is only now daring to ask. But there is another truth that cuts deeper. Behind the fame, the glamour, the scandal, and the business empire was a woman who carried wounds she rarely revealed. She spoke in interviews about her regrets, about the innocence lost too soon, about the longing to be seen for who she truly was, rather than who the world wanted her to be. She admitted that her marriage to Elvis, while filled with love, was also marked by control and manipulation. She confessed that she had to rebuild herself from the ground up, learning to make decisions for herself after years of living in his shadow. And in those confessions, the final picture of Priscilla Presley begins to take shape, not as a fairy tale princess, not as a flawless icon, but as a survivor. Her secret past, once buried under decades of silence, reveals a life defined not just by Elvis, but by the struggle to break free from him. She loved him, she protected him, she built an empire in his name, but she also endured pain, betrayal, and a loss of innocence that can never be undone. For fans, this truth is difficult, even heartbreaking. It shatters the illusion of the perfect love story, replacing it with a reality that is far more human, far more flawed, and far more haunting. Yet perhaps it is in that truth that her real legacy lies. Because Priscilla Presley's story is not just about Elvis. It is about the cost of living in someone else's shadow, the fight to reclaim one's identity, and the resilience to rise from the ruins of myth into a life of her own making. Today, when the world looks back on Elvis and Priscilla, it is no longer enough to see them as king and queen. We must see them as human beings, brilliant, broken, flawed, and forever bound together by history. Priscilla's final truth is that she was never just Elvis's wife. She was a girl who grew up too fast, a woman who carried secrets too heavy, and a survivor who outlived the legend to tell her side of the story. And in that truth, revealed at last, her legacy is forever changed.